Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Beyond the Basics. This time we're going to be talking about city development, managing population, attaching outposts, all that kind of good stuff. If you don't know already, we have a Discord where we hang out and talk about the game and organize multiplayer and all that good stuff. It's in the description below, so check that out if you want a little community to be a part of. I'd also recommend the Amplitude Community Discord as well. Good place to hang out and organize games and all that kind of stuff. I am still recovering a bit from COVID. I have a bit of a cough and some other symptoms, and I probably sound a little funny, so apologies for that, and there'll probably be a few strange cuts in here where I'm cutting out some coughing. So anyway, let's get started. Right off the bat, the very first thing you're likely to build is going to be the pottery workshop, and that's pretty much going to be every game. There are a couple exceptions to this. But the extra influence on the pottery workshop is really critical. In the early game, you're almost going to be doubling your influence output just by building the pottery workshop. And you need to be claiming as many territories as you can. You need to be attaching outposts. You need to be buying out extractors and harbors. And all these things cost influence. And you just don't have very much of it at the start of the game. Now, there are two situations where you don't really need to build the pottery workshop immediately. And the first is when you're really isolated and you're not in competition with anyone to claim any of the territories that you need. In this case, you can forego the pottery workshop because you can take more time to go ahead and claim those territories and instead invest in some other things that you need, whether that's food or production or whatever. The other case is when you start very hemmed in. Say you're surrounded by opponents, and realistically there are probably only 2 or 3 or maybe 4 territories that you can realistically claim and hold. In that case, you may want to invest in something else, particularly if you're playing against the AI on Humankind difficulty, because they love to rush. And if you are that close to them, you are going to get rushed very early in the game, and you want to get your military capabilities online as soon as possible. And the Pottery Workshop is going to slow you down in that, and isn't going to provide you nearly as much benefit as it would in most other situations. So keep those two cases in mind, but most of the time, Pottery Workshop is the way to go. Now, once you get past the Pottery Workshop, I have a bit of a rule of thumb for my early game and early game district constructions, which is that I want all my quarters to be built in 5 turns or fewer. And if I'm not able to do that, then I don't have enough production in my starting city or my starting 2 cities. And if you're going past 5 turns occasionally, it's fine. I usually prefer like 4 turns per quarter. But once you start getting above that, you end up spending a lot of time every single era just like building your emblematic quarters, and then by the time you're done, you're already going up to the next era. So you do need a minimum baseline of production, and particularly in your starting city. And as a result, I often tend to build maker's quarters first. And it's fine if this is like an emblematic quarter that's also a maker's quarter. So the Meroe Pyramid, the Egyptian Pyramid, or the Cyclopean Fortress are all fine openings. Or if you have started a city that has really high production and you're able to crank out your emblematic quarter in like 3 turns or something, then yeah, go ahead. But you really need that critical production base at the start of the game because everything else is going to be really slow if you don't have it. So Maker's Quarters at the start, pretty much every game, not necessarily always, but most of the time, unless I have enough production to support doing other things. Now, for me as well, my first population always goes on to industry, and just that extra +6 industry, you'll pretty much knock a turn off of building everything at the start of the game. You can make an exception to this if you want to put someone into science, and particularly if you're Babylon and you're going for something like a swordsman rush, that can be a viable strategy. But generally, first population, worker slot, every game. There's not a lot of deviation from that rule for me. The only exception is if I have like really, really poor food output. I can only support 1 population in my city for whatever reason. And at the start of the game, you really need population for science. So I might put that population on science if I'm getting enough industry from exploitations already. Now, other emblematic quarters, other than things like the Moreau pyramids and all that I mentioned earlier, can be a bit of a trap, right? Like the Olmec head and the astronomy house and all that. And I talked about this a little bit already, but I really want to emphasize that this should not typically be your first construction. It takes you longer to build those things if you don't have the production base, and because it scales up the cost of your future districts as well, it means it's going to take you even longer than it would have to get your production base online than had you built a maker's quarter first. So say you build your astronomy house, it costs you, 100 production and like 7 turns to do that. And then it also scales up the cost of the maker's quarter from something like 70 production to 100 production or something like that. So now it's taking you like an extra 2 turns to get your maker's quarter online after you built your astronomy house than it would have had you just built the maker's quarter first. And obviously you want to play into your advantages, but that production base at the start of the game is really critical. So don't fall for the trap of building those emblematic quarters first, unless you have a really specific strategy that you're trying to pursue, or you have really high production. Now, until districts cost scaling really ramps up, and you get some more infrastructure as well, exploitations tend to be much more valuable than population. And you do reach a point where quarters become really obscenely expensive to build if you've really amped up your production and you're building a ton of quarters. But until that point in the early game, you don't have enough buffs to your different specialist slots like researchers and workers and all that. Most of the time you're only going to be getting 6 industry or 6 science or 6 money per turn, whatever it is. Whereas with building a quarter, if I built a maker's quarter, I can get like 10, 12 production just from the quarter without needing to support a population. And as a result, in the early game, the exploitations are a lot more efficient than early population. And farmers' quarters in particular are not great at the start of the game. A lot of the times you might only be getting like 5 or 6 food from a farmer's quarter, which isn't even enough to support one population. Now, this changes a bit as the game goes on and you start to get access to some of the early infrastructure, but for the most part, pops are not as valuable. However, you still need a minimum of a few population in order to build your military. And science is like the most important thing that you get from population at the start of the game. It's practically one of the only ways to actually have decent science production in the ancient era is to have scientists. So you do still need a minimum number of population. And for that reason, you are going to invest in some agriculture quarters because you need those scientists and you need some population for your military. Don't go overboard, though. Generally, those quarters are going to be much more valuable. They're going to give you a lot better outputs. Now, a note on outposts as well at the start of the game. When you attach an outpost, it increases the build cost of your next district, including anything that's already under construction. So outposts will tend to increase construction times if you attach them in the middle of building a district. So wait until you're building infrastructure or units or you're just starting a fresh district before you attach an outpost. And I find 2 or 3 territories to be the sweet spot for the number of attached territories. 4 can be doable, but the more attached territories you have, the more time you're going to be spending building repeats of the same emblematic quarter every single era, and you may struggle a bit with stability, but your production queue is just going to get like so jammed up every era that you're not producing anything other than your emblematic quarter every single era of the game. So don't get too big on your cities. Now, you can get away with it if you're playing something OP like the Khmer, and you went and got a bunch of Jama Masjids in the next era, and you're getting stuff like your percent production modifier on your capital, and you have this massive capital and all that. It is doable, but for most games, you're probably not going to do it. It's going to be more efficient to have a bunch of cities that have a few territories attached rather than one massive city with like tons of territories. Now, additionally, on the early game, let's talk about holy sites very briefly, because holy sites are a little weird since they're fairly expensive. Now, if you're close to another player, religious sites become more worthwhile to battle in terms of your faith output if you really want specific tenets specifically. Now, if you're quite far or isolated from other players, you don't need to worry about faith output as much since all your new pops are going to be following your religion anyway. Other players' faith output isn't as important to your game. So it can be worth building just for the stability, but if you're really far away, you don't need to worry about it as much. And finally, when it comes to early game population management, I micromanage my pops pretty much every single turn. I look for opportunities to finish things in a single turn. So, am I producing a district in 2 turns, but I can move a pop or maybe 2 to finish it in 1? I'm going to do that. What about a technology? Is it taking me 2 turns to research, and if I move a worker into being a scientist, it'll finish in 1 turn? Yeah, I'm going to do that. What about growing another pop? Maybe it finishes in 2 or 3 turns, and I can move one onto a farmer and finish it next turn. I will do that. So I try to find those opportunities every single turn, and that's why I'm constantly opening up my city menu, looking for the different opportunities to move my pops around. And the advantage of population is that they're versatile, right? They're not a committed investment like districts are. So take advantage of that. Move them around to get every single advantage that you possibly can every single turn that you're playing the game. Now, let's talk about going farther in the game a little bit. One thing I really want to emphasize is that every city you possess needs to serve a purpose. And the way you have them serve a purpose is by specializing, okay? And now there are a couple exceptions to that. Your first couple cities in particular, by their very nature, are going to be generalist. Your capital in particular kind of needs to do everything for you at the start of the game. So you're going to invest in a lot of different things in your capital so you can keep up on money and science and production and growth and warfare and all that kind of stuff. But as the game goes on and you get access to more and more cities, then you are going to be wanting to specialize because it is more efficient. And early and mid-game cities in particular don't really have the capacity to support building everything you need to support a bunch of different outputs in most of your games. So think about all the different infrastructure for food and money and science and industry and how long that would take you to build in every single city. You'd be tied down building infrastructure forever. Instead, what you want to do is take your city and say, I want to specialize this city in research. And then you just build the research quarters, you have a minimum amount of production, and you build the infrastructure related to science. Doing this means that you're concentrating your production in a meaningful way, right? You're not just getting this hodgepodge of different infrastructure, right? Think about building the infrastructure that gives you plus 10% money on, 5 cities that all have 5 trader slots, or building that one infrastructure in one city with 20 trader slots and a whole bunch of market quarters. It is way more efficient in terms of empire-wide production to do the latter rather than do the former. Now, this isn't to say that you shouldn't build anything but research quarters in your research specialist cities, right? This is because you still need some production, you still need some food. So don't skimp on those things, right? And don't just build research and market quarters in given cities for all eternity. They need to be able to build those things in a reasonable amount of time and have the population to support all the jobs that are available. So make sure you're keeping up on those things, but don't overinvest, right? These are still specialist cities. You want them to have as many research quarters as possible, and particularly if you have money, then you can help support those things as well, even if they have lower production, by buying out infrastructure, by buying out quarters, that kind of thing. Now, you can also have specialist production cities, and these can be like the core that produce your military and help you get builder stars. You'll find these may have the capacity to branch out a little bit later to do other things because they have such high production, they can support having additional infrastructure or additional quarters. So as the game goes on, feel free to supplement those kind of cities with some gold or science or whatever else you need. Now, if you don't know what you need to build next in your city, it's because you really don't have a plan or a vision for what that city needs to be. So how do you go about the thought process of specializing a city? So first, consider the resources in the city. Are there lots of luxuries? Markets benefit from luxury adjacencies. So if you have a ton of luxuries in your city, that might be a great spot for market quarters. Likewise, strategics can provide some science. Now, controlling certain luxuries in your entire empire also makes certain quarters more efficient. So if you have a bunch of gemstones, for instance, providing more gold on markets for each gemstone that you control, you may want to specialize a bit more in money output than in science because you have a strategic advantage in producing money relative to some of your opponents. You should also consider terrain. So makers' quarters and research quarters in particular benefit a lot from same quarter adjacency, particularly once you get with some of the later infrastructure, and you get a lot of infrastructure for those two in particular throughout the game. So open areas with lots of adjacency potential is good, and mountains are also really good for production as well. Now, you should also consider your era stars. So think about what era stars have you struggled to get up to this point of the game. If you haven't gotten any of the money era stars yet, you probably want a specialist money city, right? You're leaving fame on the table by not producing money. Are you behind the technology curve? You need more research quarters. Get your research specialist city up and running. Agrarian and Builder stars are a little less straightforward in this regard because you need growth and production across your entire empire and not concentrated in one particular city. So if you're still struggling with either of those things, then make a couple investments across multiple cities rather than just concentrating in one or two. If the city that you are trying to plan is a captured city, obviously consider what is already there. If there's lots of food, that can kind of be steered into anything, same with production. But if there are a lot of research quarters or market quarters, the decision's a bit easier, particularly if some of the infrastructure is online already. You should also consider proximity to other players. You may want high production and population cities closer to your opponents so that you can quickly reinforce your military. Alternatively, you may want those cities farther away so that losing a city close to the enemy isn't crippling when you're fighting them. It kind of just depends on your war philosophy, so think about what you prefer. And this can go for things like a scientist city as well, right? If you are really, really hesitant to lose some of your science output, or that would be a really crippling blow for you, have that city be one that's farther away from your enemy rather than closer to it. And finally, think about what your civilization has an advantage in doing, given like the emblematic quarters in the different cities, your legacy traits, and your different luxury resources that you have access to. You should really try to play into those advantages as much as possible. So, if you've picked like the Babylonians and the Greeks and you have a bunch of emblematic quarters that can produce science and, advantages on your researchers and all that kind of stuff, you can play into the research angle more. Just don't forget to supplement that and don't leave fame on the table for other things because you've over-specialized. So let's talk a bit about infrastructure. And fundamentally, there are 5 types of infrastructure. The first is one that gives you a flat yield to one of your FIMs on like your city center. So that's like +5 money on your city center. These are not typically worth building. So let's move straight into the second. The second gives you yields on exploitations. So for instance, food on river, production on forest, etc. These are obviously going to be dependent on your geography, whether or not they're worth building. The third gives you bonuses on quarters, and that can be a flat bonus, it can be adjacency bonuses with other quarters, but it's always one and usually both. These are typically the most important infrastructure over the course of the game. There are also a couple infrastructure that give you some flat bonuses based on access to strategic resources that are coupled with these adjacency and other flat bonuses, kind of like the Forge, and these get better the more of the strategic resources that you have. Now, the fourth type gives you bonuses on jobs. So, for instance, more science on researchers, more production on workers, more food on farmers, that kind of thing. And finally, the fifth one is one that gives you a percent modifier to some kind of output, like plus 10% science. These also become really important later in the game, but you don't get access to them until much later either. There aren't a lot of these percent modifiers available earlier in the game. There are a couple of exceptions to these five that break the mold. The most obvious one is the one that gives +1 science per population, which can often be worth building in cities. But in general, these five types of infrastructure are the five types. Now, fundamentally, when to build infrastructure versus building another district is really a pretty simple calculation of how much of a yield am I getting for the production costs that I put into it. So say I start the game and I can build a maker's quarter for 70 industry. That'll give me 10 industry per turn once it's completed. Alternatively, I can build the lumber yard, which costs 200 industry and gives me +1 industry on forest and +1 industry on woodland. So the cost to output ratio for the maker's quarter is 7, which you get by 70 divided by 10. The lower this ratio, the better the investment is. So a ratio of 1 means that you get exactly as much out of the quarter infrastructure in a single turn as it costs to build that infrastructure. Assuming 1-to-1 convertibility of yields, right? So say you making a science quarter, science isn't exactly 1-to-1 convertible to production, but you get the general idea. Now, to achieve the same or better ratio for the lumber yard, we would need to provide 29 industry or more, given its cost. And you can do that by solving 7 equals 200 over your unknown variable, and you algebra it out. Hopefully you all know some algebra. This one's pretty simple, thankfully. Now, obviously, 29 industry for the lumber yard at this point of the game would be impossible. So, initially, districts are far more efficient to build than infrastructure. Your infrastructure is largely going to be reliant on you actually having a fairly sizable number of quarters and exploitations to take advantage of. But because they scale up in cost as you grow your city, the cost of the districts are eventually going to outstrip the cost of building infrastructure, because infrastructure costs do not inflate over the course of the game. Some infrastructure are more efficient than others, but in general, the ones that you want every game are going to be the ones that give you bonuses for quarter adjacency and flat quarter bonuses, as well as the percentage modifiers for your city's main outputs. Now, obviously, if you're not producing any money in a city, you have no market quarters, you have no traders, you don't want to build the infrastructure that gives you plus 10% money or the infrastructure that gives you extra money on market quarters. That doesn't make any sense. So obviously consider that as well. Now, I don't recommend sitting here and doing this calculation every single time you're deciding what to build. You should have a general idea of when an infrastructure becomes efficient to build. Don't worry about getting it on the exact efficient turn. If you build an infrastructure one district too early or one too late, it's really not that big of a deal, because the amount of time you're going to spend slowing the game down to do these calculations every turn isn't really worth it from an enjoyment perspective. It's just useful to think about and have in the back of your head when you're deciding when to build an infrastructure. Now, finally, I want to talk about something that I actually find rather difficult to explain, which also probably means that I don't have as much of a grasp on it as a concept as some of the other ideas that I've talked about. So, take my word with a grain of salt here. But if there's one thing that I'm certain of when it comes to managing population, it's that at the start of the game, exploitations are much more efficient than population, and particularly for industry. You can regularly get maker's quarters giving you 8 to 10 industry without any infrastructure investment, where a worker is only going to provide you 6 production. And in order to get that worker, you also have a time lag, because you need to be able to grow that population first with food. You need to be able to support that population with enough food as well. And then once the population's grown, then you can move it over on the industry. And it's also pretty hard to support high population at the start of the game. So a really good farmer's quarter will still only net you 1 additional population if you're lucky, but sometimes won't even provide enough food for that. You'll frequently find yourself in a position where a farmer's quarter is only going to provide you 5 food, and you need 8 to support a pop at the start of the game. So farming is pretty inefficient. A lot of the food you're going to be getting at the very start is just going to be based on wherever you put your outpost. However, you still need population for science output and military production. And because of this, I try to maintain at least 6 pop in my cities at the start of the game. I may invest more into growth if I have some really, really good growth tiles that make my agriculture quarters more efficient. But the problem here is that if you go heavy on growth at the start of the game, you're not going to have the specialist slots that you need to actually make use of them. So say you built like 4 agriculture quarters at the start, and you're supporting, 6, 8 pops, whatever it is. Suddenly you're in the situation where your population doesn't have enough specialist slots to actually work, right? You get your 2 research slots, and you get your 2 trader slots, and you get your 2 production slots at the start, but because you haven't invested in anything else, the people sitting on food aren't really getting you anything, and you have these excess pops that aren't really contributing. So you want to have slots for them to fill as well. And because exploitations are more efficient than population, and because pops take some time to grow, it's generally more efficient to get the slots first and then get the population to fill those slots than it is to do it the other way around. So as a result of sort of the inefficiency of the farmer's quarter at the start of the game, and the fact that you don't really need that many pops relative to how many exploitations you need, I tend to rely mostly on infrastructure for my early growth, supplemented with a couple farmer's quarters. So the animal barns in particular are really good, especially if you have access to, more than, say, 2 horses. You get +5 food for every horse you have access to. The 2 river food infrastructures are also really good, and that combined with the animal barns is typically enough to get me by with a decent population for the early game. They can be a little bit more expensive than a district, but building them also won't inflate the cost of building more makers quarters or my emblematic quarters or other quarters. And if you have farmers quarters, the animal barns will also improve those a little bit. Now there will come a point where extra industry is a little redundant and you already have the emblematic quarters that you want. In my experience, that's a good time to get some growth going between eras with a couple farmers quarters. Since you've invested in other quarters already, you'll have plenty of slots for them to work. And since, you're already in a position where you have enough production that you need and you have the core things online that you already need, getting extra population becomes a little bit more of a priority in those kind of situations. Now, as the game goes on, the population also gets more efficient at working their jobs. And my goal for population in my cities is to have enough population that they fill out all the jobs for whatever output I've specialized my city in. Some overflow on this is fine. You can put them into worker slots since every city needs production. It's unlikely you'll be able to do this very early in the game, but you'll get buffs to food throughout the tech tree. And unless you've managed to get a really good agrarian culture or you have a ton of good harbor locations, I wouldn't typically expect to reach the benchmark of filling out my worker or scientist or whatever slots until sometime in the early modern. And even then, I may be a little bit behind, depending on how much I've invested into food already. You can do a similar calculation as before when considering how valuable food is, where you consider the industry cost to output ratio. So say you put a farmer's quarter down that'll provide 20 food, which should be enough to support 2 population. And the farmer's quarter costs 200 industry to build. But food isn't actually the output you're concerned with, so what you're interested in is the outputs of the jobs your population will be working. So say you plan to put the 2 pops on science, and you get 10 science per scientist. Your actual investment is 200 industry for 20 science. You just need to be aware that because of how growth works, this investment is also significantly time lagged compared to just investing in quarters. That can make a difference, but think about your pop growth as like a separate production queue, right? you can get population growing and have districts constructing or infrastructure constructing at the same time. And ideally, you want to have both of these moving. If I have a city where my population growth has ground to an absolute halt and I have some good food tiles I can work, I'll go ahead and invest in an agriculture quarter at that point. But if I'm growing at a reasonable pace, say, you know, I'm getting a new pop every 4 turns or something like that, I'm usually more concerned with other things because pops are just not as efficient as exploitations early in the game. Pops are kind of tricky because of the time lag and, you know, the fact that they're not quite as efficient, but at the same time, having pops is more efficient than not having pops, so you always want to keep growing a little bit. It's a difficult balance to strike, and honestly, you kind of have to get a feel for it. And it's difficult to describe how to get a feel for it, and if I come up with a good way to describe that, then I will probably add that into another video. But for now, this is the advice that I can leave you with. So, wrapping up, really, I think the critical part here is consider, basically, for infrastructure, what the cost to output is. And when it comes to developing cities, plan them out. Have an objective for them. You know, think about what their purpose is. Because without that, you don't know what you're going to be building. But with that, you have a clear objective. And you want to help supplement your empire. Say you want to close up a weak point, or you want to really capitalize on a strong point, whatever it is. So don't leave fame on the table. Remember, that's a victory condition. Don't try to generalize all your cities to do everything. It is way less efficient than having specialist cities. And in the early game, get your production base online. It is critical. Population is not worth as much as exploitations in the ancient era. There's just really no buffs to, you know, worker slots or whatever. It's way less efficient than having makers quarters or agriculture quarters or whatever it is. So I hope you found this video helpful. I know it's a little more loosey-goosey. There's a lot of, you need to get a feel for it. But hopefully some of the things I talked about here helps your game a little bit. And I am recording this while sick, so I'm sure I left a bajillion things out. So if you have comments or questions or whatever, feel free to leave them below. And, you know, if I think of anything super interesting that I forgot to add to this conversation, I'll add my own comment and pin it. Or if it's something really substantial, I'll add a video on it at some point in the future. So thanks for tuning in. I'll see you next time.